back to our last two sessions, the most important two sessions. This is where we wrap it up and we say what was exciting about today and in the sector. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Emmett Cunningham. I've been a long-time investor for about 20 years until last January when I retired from Blackstone Ventures. I like to say rewired because I'm still pretty active. And I have a very strong affinity for OIS. Craig and I started this more than a decade ago, and it's great to see that it's still going strong. I'm going to ask my co-panelists to introduce themselves, and then we have a series of, I think, very relevant questions. But today we're going to cover the good, the bad, and the unknown, and we'll get to that in a second. So to my immediate right, please.
Yes, thanks, Emmett. So Adit Ghosh, I work with NEA, so we're a global sort of venture capital fund investing in healthcare and tech. I'm focused on private biopharma investing. We're investing out of two funds, each around $3 billion across all indications and therapeutic areas and modalities, but ophthalmology is obviously an area of interest. In terms of my background, I come from Lazard, where I was a healthcare banker advising biopharma companies, and then background in biology and finance before that.
Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Stout. I'm a partner in EcoR1 Capital. We're based in San Francisco. We manage about $4 billion and invest in therapeutics companies exclusively, but both private and public. Excited to be here today. Thank you, Emmett.
Hi, everyone. Anna Chen. I'm a principal on the team at Fraser Life Sciences. We're a dedicated life sciences venture fund. Our current fund, private side, is about $1 billion. We also have a public fund, also about $1 billion. And so can invest kind of across the spectrum from early to late. I focus on our private side investments and company creation efforts. And we invest across therapeutic areas, but have had a long-standing interest in ophthalmology, including Iconis, which is a recent company creation effort that hopefully I'll be able to tell you a little bit more about in this panel.
Hi, Firas, Rahhal. I'm a vitreoretinal surgeon by training, and I still practice in Los Angeles in a large group that does a lot of the clinical trials that we've talked about here today. And I'm also a partner at Excite Ventures, which is located in New York City, centralized in New York City. And we exclusively so far make investments in ophthalmology, both front and back of the eye, drugs and diagnostics, and generally early stage stuff, seed to Series A, although we've gone in a little bit later when we had the wherewithal to do so.
Great. Well, thank you. I maybe from time to time ask someone to close that door because every time it opens, I can't hear what the panelists are saying. So we now have just been on what I might call a bit of a roller coaster ride with the markets, the sector, how much money flows, why it doesn't. So I'm going to start and go down and ask our panelists what their take on where we've been and most importantly, where we are and where we're going in the near term. So I'm not going to start in order. I'm going to start with Carolyn.
Okay. We have definitely been in a little bit of a boom and bust cycle in biotech over the last 4 to 5 years. And I actually think very recently we started returning to a sense of normalcy. In 2023, I think seed and Series A companies in ophthalmology alone raised around $600 million. That was third only to private companies in oncology and neuroscience. And so the funding activity has actually picked up quite a bit and is happening. Whereas 2 years ago, I think it was difficult, regardless of what stage you were or how great your data was, to raise capital. And 2 years before that, it felt like money was growing on trees and there was capital available for anything. So we're in this IC period of normalcy, although I think valuations are still somewhat modest and investors are being a little bit more thoughtful about how broadly to fund pipelines these days. But at least we're back in business.
And I'm going to ask for a number I want to ask each of you the same question, but I want a number at the end. And this number is, if valuations were X at the peak 4 years ago, what are they now? What percent of X generally?
Well, if you look at the public comps, it's pretty ugly. I think private companies are probably still trading about half of where they were at the peak.
Good. All right. Anna?
Yeah, and I totally agree with what Karen just said. I think the two things I would add is, one, venture capitalists have a lot of dry powder to deploy, and many of us, Fraser included, kind of sat on our hands for the first 9 months of 2023 and didn't do any deals. And now we have capital to deploy and good companies are out raising. So I think the private markets have, in my opinion, come back, blazing in the first few months of 24. The second thing I'll add is for ophthalmology in particular, I think, before it felt like in the last sort of boom cycle, it felt like everybody was all about oncology. And now pharma, in terms of M&A and also venture capitalists, have sort of shifted away from, saying, okay, we're only going to do oncology deals. Fraser, we have had a long-standing interest in ophthalmology, and we've kind of invested across TAs. But now that, strategics too are starting to, many strategics are sort of thinking about going into ophthalmology or have already started to go into ophthalmology. I think there's really quite a bit more excitement and enthusiasm for the space.
Great, thank you. And for us, you're at the very beginning of the chain, company creation, seed investing. What have you seen?
Yeah, I'm not as bullish as these two comments, not because I disagree, but we are in a different pool for sure. And I think, look, always the seed to Series A, that early period you're talking about, Blumenkrantz calls it the valley of death. It's always the challenge, and it's always hard to raise money in those areas for the companies and for us, for those companies. It has maybe improved a tiny bit in recent months, but I still feel like it's at a bad period and struggling a little bit in those early stages to get capital, maybe more so than the baseline of always. So I don't think we've quite recovered there yet. I think the larger VCs who come in later, lower risk, phase 3 trials kind of stuff, yeah, I think that's come back in a very significant way in my observation.
Good. Adit?
Yeah, for us at NEA, I think we're, again, a little bit more later stage generally, so it's a lot of the risk has been taken off the table, which we thank you for, obviously. But so then for us, it's, Caroline has kind of mentioned before, there's a lot of dry powder to deploy for these sorts of companies, and there's lots of opportunities there. The good thing is that we have time to kind of do our diligence and sign these term sheets and really do our work there to figure out which companies in science we really want to back. So it's not like those peak times from before, and we can really back the companies that have strong science that we want to support going forward.
And I'm very optimistic, just to put my own 2 cents into this. When I started in this business now more than 20 years ago, the amount of capital that flowed into life science venture was about 1/20th of what it was at the peak. Now, that was the peak. It dropped almost in half, you've heard, but it's coming back. And even half of 20-fold is still 10-fold. And the other thing I would add is that these funds are 10-year cycles. So they've always had the money. They just hit the pause button because they had to stop the hemorrhaging of their other companies. They've always had the money, and they have a limited time frame to put it to work. So the money will flow. It has to flow. And you'll see, I think it'll be a pretty good time. And seed is always the last to come back because it's the riskiest. And people have to put a toe in before they jump in, so to speak.
And the LPs are of a different variety, right? The risk mitigation for them might be of more paramount concern in their personal financial story.
Good. So I made an allusion to Marconi with the good and the bad and the ugly, but I called it the good, the bad, and the unknown. And so what I'm going to ask each of our panelists now to talk about is just start with the good. Pick one thing about this sector that is good and promising and hopeful. And it can be from today, if you want to be brave and bold. It can be from your portfolio, or it can be completely unrelated. But what gives you great hope? What have you seen that excites you? What do you always want to see as an investment when that company or subsector is out raising money? I'm going to start with Anna on this one.
Yeah, so I'm a bit biased, admittedly, but I'll tell you a little bit about Iconis, which is a company that it's a spin-out of Ascendis that Fraser led at the beginning of this year. So Iconis is developing extended release biologics platform for intravitreal injection. And I know this is a space and a problem that many have tried to tackle and tried to, kind of advance forward. And we've seen, advancements in the space. We really think, again, biased, but we really think Iconis has nailed the approach. And it's a very modular platform. We're very excited to, develop our internal programs, but also partner with others on interesting new assets. that could be used in the context of this. And one thing I'll mention, what got us excited about Iconis in particular, is that Ascendis actually had used this platform, it's called Transcon, in the context of now improved drug in the endocrine space. So it's completely different from ophthalmology. But to us as investors, that de-risked the platform quite a bit and got us excited that you could apply this platform to ophthalmology. Of course, the eye has its unique set of challenges and advantages as well. And to that end, they had some really good preclinical data indicating to us that this could actually work. So I think, intravitreal injection is extended release biologics is still very, very interesting space. We've obviously made some progress here, and obviously the Vabysmos of the world continue to gain market share because of the longer duration. But I was excited to see that there was still a lot of innovation to be made there, and a lot of good we can do for patients in terms of that convenience of dosing.
Great. So that's one vote for sustained release, especially biologics. Adit?
I agree, definitely a very interesting area. I would say just generally, if I had to pick one thing that we're really focused on at NEA, it's non-incrementalism in general. And I think that that's a good example of that. Extended release, it really does change kind of the paradigm in anti-VEGFs for wet AMD and other areas. If I had to pick one area of myself, dry AMD and GA is definitely an area of interest, especially novel targets that are well elucidated and connected to the disease pathophysiology and underlying cause of the pathophysiology. So things that are disease modifying in that area and able to move earlier. So that's definitely an area of interest that we're really digging in at NEA, and area of interest that we find to be non-incremental.
That means you're going to have to take some risk.
Yeah, we're going to have to take risks there. But if, again, it's de-risked in the sense that if the target is somewhat, they prove it out preclinically or clinically consistently across animal models or in patients, then it's de-risked to a certain extent in that matter.
Great. For us, what are you excited about?
If it were one thing, and it would be at this meeting, most of the stuff I think that's great was covered here today. I would agree it's dry AMD. I think that's the new 20-year run of advances. And it's almost inevitable that process is going to take place on a therapeutic side with biologics and so forth. And a close second would be drug delivery. And full disclosure, we have investments in both of those areas. ONL on the dry AMD side, who are doing great. You heard from them today. And Rivana, as well as Valitor, who's not here, on the drug delivery intravitreal side. That's a very close 1 and 1A for me, but if I had to pick one, I think what we saw in anti-VEGF drugs may not be reproducible, but there's every reason to think it can be. This is an even bigger market than wet AMD, maybe not bigger than diabetic retinopathy. And the mechanism of action, it's still wildly unclear what's the right mechanism, and there'll probably be multiple targets that are worth hitting. And with great respect for the two companies that are doing it now, the data to this point has been relatively not as compelling as that we've seen with the wet AMD side yet. And usually that keeps climbing forward.
Well, as someone who was involved with Macugen, they do get better with time.
Yeah, exactly. I gave you a plug on the first slide of the day, but you weren't here probably.
I was in spirit, I was. Yeah. Carol?
Yeah, as a general theme, I would say I'm excited about what's going on at the intersection of genetics, immunology, and ophthalmology. And I think that the complement inhibitors are a really nice example of that coming together, where we knew this complement biology was implicated in geographic atrophy. Apellis had a drug in the complement space, which is traditionally thought of as an immunology target, and yet I would argue that the long-term data is showing pretty robust effects in preventing progression of the disease. And so that happens to be our fund's largest investment, but it's also a theme that I'm excited to see play out. And it's nice to see things like Roche's IL-6 inhibitor also making such great strides in DME and uveitis, and there are some earlier targets as well that we're excited about.
Great. And I'll give my own bias, and I'm just going to step away from ophthalmology for a second and look at the entirety of biotech, most active of which is oncology and immunology, of course. And if you look in those areas that are very target-rich, much more target-rich than we are, there's this absolute renaissance of multifunctionality, bispecifics, multifunctioning targeting, and we're just now beginning to see that. Faricimab, since its launch, I've been told, is the most rapidly growing drug in Genentech's history. And you may have seen some of those curves where it's now totally supplanted Lucentis. Some of that may be planned, but it's a $3 or $4 billion drug, and it's going to go far beyond that, and that speaks to the multifunctionality. So we have Rivopsis, which, all full disclosure, I'm a personal investor in and involved with. We heard from Illuminix today, and we're going to hear many, many more of these multifunctional molecules because we have validated targets, and we can mix and match them in that way. It's happening in immunology, oncology. It's going to happen in ophthalmology. So that's the good. What about the bad for us? What is, other than the fact that you can't find money? What's the bad?
You mean on the medical clinical side, not financial? Yeah. It's always financial for me. That's the bad. My patients get great results. They all see 20/20 at the end of the day.
They do. Yeah, you're a great doctor.
I guess the bad, and I wouldn't push back on the multi-targeted drugs that you just talked about. I think it's fantastic, and that's clearly going to be a new frontier. But I think a little bit of the bad is so much of our innovation, because of the great success of the anti-VEGF drugs and their tremendous efficacy and safety, is and I think Adit just made this point, kind of alluded to it, we're a little bit caught up as a field with very incremental improvement. I think clinically these patients do very well, and when we put it on the slide deck, it looks impressive to say 30 to 40%, non-responders, but those are very relative terms. In real life, it's fewer than that. These drugs work very well, and it's hard to get market share when something is that good, or even get to equivalency so you can get approval. The point being, there's a lot of money for good reason going into it, but I think the bad, if there is anything, is that looks to me like really narrow incremental improvement, whereas some of these other areas that were mentioned here and all day long could be kind of earth-shaking improvements in regenerative medicine and other areas, GA, et cetera.
It turns out that disruption is really hard. It's really hard to have a penicillin with every drug. But I hear what you're saying. Much of what we do, just by definition, is incremental. Absolutely. Anna? The bad?
Yeah, I would say some of the challenge here, especially in today's venture environment, and maybe more so last year, is how long it takes to get to clinical proof of concept that people believe that it'll work, right? I think back when money was flowing, growing on trees, like you could raise a huge round and you could guarantee that you're going to get to data that people actually believe and then give you value for. I think today, there's a lot of these indications, right, or aspects of drugs like neuroprotection or even GA, right, where these trials are very long and they require a lot of capital to get there. So I think, it'd be awesome if we had ways to sort of understand how well the drug is doing earlier on in the course of disease, especially for some of these where there's still a lot of unmet need.
The models are quite limited, actually, and not very predictive. Caroline?
Well, that's what I was going to say. I think that the difficult thing about ophthalmology in particular is just the lack of translatability from the animal models to the clinic. But I think the other bad thing for biotech in general right now is that the macro environment is just not particularly conducive to large speculative bets. And I think until we have interest rates start to come down, that's going to continue to be a headwind for the sector.
Just to follow up on that, what will it take for people to make those more speculative bets, do you think?
Well, I think, we all live in this kind of much greater ecosystem. And so it's difficult, I think, for a generalist investor who could put money in a treasury and get a nice return and then say, well, this looks pretty good in rabbits, make that bet. I think it's going to take this macro change to really see the kind of capital to transform this sector. I think until then, you're going to see the specialist folks on this panel who are, making very specific concentrated bets in companies. But that's kind of how I see it for the short term.
Yeah, I would just add, we don't know what we don't know until we know it. And I would have never guessed that iBio's Wnt activator would be apparently as efficacious as it appears to be, which on a relatively limited number of patients. But there you have it, right? You roll the dice, and sometimes you really win. And we've heard data today from other agents that are quite exciting and potentially could be our next best class of agents for these diseases.
Yep. I'm going to give my answer on what kind of the bad is, but I'm going to caveat by saying hopefully it doesn't matter. And that's kind of strategic interest in ophthalmology. I think that's going to be sort of a headwind moving forward, but hopefully it doesn't matter if we're backing good science moving forward. I think that there have been some issues with M&A in the space where, gene therapy companies, for example, were acquired, Biogen, Novartis, and then they fully have exited ophthalmology because maybe they realized that they couldn't take on this early stage risk, whatever. It's not as promising area as other things. There's opportunity cost to everything. So this is definitely like a headwind. But there's a bright spot. Last year we obviously had the Iveric deal and other good deals, big deals. I think Firas mentioned earlier, deal volume went down, but deal value went up. And I think that largely speaks to the fact that these pharmas are moving later stage. They're moving to areas where there's less risk. But what that results in is what Anna mentioned earlier, which is that it's a longer runway to kind of get to that stage of approval or that de-risking that pharma wants to engage in. So what I'd like to see is pharma engage earlier in partnerships. One of our portcos has done that and get involved there to de-risk things moving forward, provide that non-dilutive capital so that we could see things through to approval.
Yeah. Just to follow up on the bad, are there, and I didn't tell you what I would ask this question. In all this full disclosure, I do give the question list to the panelists beforehand. I don't want to surprise them, but I'm going to surprise you now. Are there companies, areas, topics, not specific companies, but are there things that you just can't get excited about in ophthalmology? You either have been burned or it's an approach. Let's just say gene therapy. I don't know that that's the case, but whatever you pick, is there something that is hard to get through your partnership or just for your group to do for any given reason? For us, are there things you say thanks but no thanks to?
Honestly, not really. I think we obviously say a no a lot, but it's more specific than any broad stroke about any subclass. You mentioned gene therapy and regenerative medicine. That's a hard one for us. As a clinician, I love it. I actually just did one of those RegenX procedures Thursday. It's a very elegant procedure, Ram. But that's a very expensive and long course. So for us, that's a tough one. It's not an absolute no, for sure. We'll hear it, we'll be interested in it, and we might even, put a nickel in it. But it's got to be a little shorter for us, I guess, if we can find that.
Anna?
Yeah, I think similar. We would look at everything, and I think we've done some sort of non-traditional deals as a fund. So nothing's like out of scope per se. I think we do have a little bit of an allergic reaction to like systemic AAV delivered gene therapies, but for the eye, obviously it's quite different. The thing that I would say too is echoing that a little bit is like the longer timelines, things that will take, years and years to get to that clinical proof of concept. I think right now in this environment is quite challenging.
Adit?
I think generally, we also look at everything and we'll evaluate everything. One thing that we do consider though is kind of what is our minimum returns threshold, and in venture, especially for a fund of our size, we need something that will really move the needle. So if there isn't really a commercially viable market, that's definitely something we have to consider and underwrite. Gene therapy for a very specific mutation that's, not that well, represented in the population, that could be tough to get behind. Not saying that we wouldn't do it, but it's definitely a tough area because we need to underwrite sort of that 3 to 5x and 20% plus IRR going forward and, a large sort of return overall in capital.
Yeah, I would say the areas where the commercial return is challenging are also areas that we have a little bit of a harder time understanding. A lot of the drugs in the front of the eye have become like that. And so it's not to say we wouldn't look at them, but the hurdle bar is very high. And until that commercial model, I think, changes. And frankly, going back to what Adit said also about the pharma partners, there's very, very few who will partner a program like that. And so your exit opportunities are more limited. And there's sort of a monopoly dynamic that occurs, which is great for them, not as great for us. But we do like gene therapy and regenerative medicine. So those are areas of interest. Come talk to us.
And just add, I'm going to add my perspective from when I was actively investing, which I am not, so you don't have to worry about these perhaps. But I would echo first, there has to be a market. So we used to have a cutoff of 500 million. If it's not 500 million, it's hard to get behind because it today costs a couple hundred, 300 million to get drugs approved. They're very expensive. So, but there's no market there. It's really hard. I'd say if you don't have a development candidate, if you have something that you haven't yet refined to the point where you can move it into IND enabling studies, most investors are going to say, come back when you do. It's just, that can go from 6 months to never, really, especially for a small molecule. So you really have to have that. And I'll just say that the inter-segment is really challenging today. You look at a drug like Xiidra, and this is in public domain, their gross revenues is maybe 1.4, 1.5, whatever it is, but their net is like 400, 450. And that's due to the demanded rebates and coupons, et cetera, the negotiations with the payers, which is to say, in inter-segment, if you're going into a crowded sector where you're not as differentiated as the payers would like you to be, or especially if there's already an existing option, that is to say the unmet need is not clear and obvious, they'll force you to take deep discounts, and you basically have to start with a $3 billion drug to have a $1 billion drug. So it's very, very challenging in the interior segment today. But that said, Dompé has a drug that meets an unmet need and is an orphan and apparently is able to bill $100,000 per patient per year. So it really depends on the unmet need. Okay, the last question is, what keeps you awake at night? And this could be anything. It could be the IRA and drug pricing. It could be the wars around the world, whatever or the economy broadly. It could be the next election for that matter. So I'll start on this end. Adit, what keeps you awake at night?
Well, all that keeps me up at night, but I'd say in ophthalmology, and I think just generally in biopharma, a major uncertainty for us is kind of what the effect of AI will do across the entire spectrum, from drug discovery all the way through to patient selection and moving forward. I think that we just made our first bet in the AI space at NEA, but it took a long while to get around to it and really make that bet at a time when we think that we're reaching kind of an inflection point. But we're still not sure, how much of a force multiplier it will be going forward.
I would say one of the headwinds for, one of the tailwinds for the ophthalmology drug development over the last few years has been the transparency and leadership of the FDA and Wiley Chambers. And I think that's been incredibly helpful for companies and for investors because there was a very clear sense of what the bar is to get a drug approved and what the process is going to be. Now with the new division, we haven't seen a whole lot of precedent yet. And so that's a big unknown that for me keeps me up somewhat at night.
My 3-year-old for the most part. But no, I think it is kind of what folks have mentioned already is like, strategics and their position and their role on, ophthalmology and providing exits, but also being able to take a drug from development stage to really launching it, commercializing it, and impacting patients, right? We really want drugs in the hands of those folks. And I think I'm hopeful that hopefully more strategics come into this arena because there's a lot of really good innovation coming through the pipe.
My 25-year-old. Different kind of late night lack of sleep. Nothing in particular, but it was mentioned earlier by Carolyn, I think again for the area we're investing and the types of LPs, these at least relatively higher interest rates and the prolongation of that, I think puts a lot of jeopardy. What often ends up being the rate limiting factor is smaller companies that have promised just running out of cash and not being able to get more to deliver on their product. And I think this cost of capital is affecting us pretty significantly with the type of LPs that we try to recruit into these raises.
Good. I have a red button, a red dot here saying I'm out of time, so I apologize. If you want to hear my answer, you'll have to pin me in the hallways. Thanks to my panelists here, and I'd invite up the public panelists. Thank you.
Thanks.